Chapter 924. Prepare for Impact. Lieutenant Go Yi issued another command. Luo Nan, who was already wearing the exoskeleton armor, had over 10 methods to easily stabilize his body. He just turned his head to glance, and saw that Xianzhu was still held in place by magnetic belts. He relaxed and cast his gaze outside once more. It was at this time that he heard Xianzhu laugh. This is the best viewing platform. Luo Nan didn't understand. His mind was already attracted by the leaping flames in the outside world. Even with the 2 layers of filtering from the metal visor and the isolation cover, the high-energy jet that gushed and flowed outside was still extremely eye-catching. Of course, this was due to the deep data analysis of the panoramic simulation system, which allocated large amounts of computing power to this phenomenon. Right now, the 11 maintenance soldiers on the Earth Layer Patroller had already constructed a standard array. From Luo Nan's perspective, this was the complete or upgraded version of the formatted space constructed by the burners back on Earth. But at the same time, it was a weakened version on the mental plane. The 11 people in the array were interconnected with each other's energies. Even though they were more conservative in their use on the mental plane, they were able to closely coordinate and form a joint force with the support of the same system. Luo Nan, who had a relatively high level of cultivation in the mental side, was able to sense how strands of his soul strength were divided, converging into the tight structure of the array, and how it was used in an orderly manner. He had a similar experience when he was partnered with Liang Lu before, but that 2-person structure was far too simple. It was far inferior to the precision and standard he was seeing now. What's more, the flames were soaring and the high temperature of the external environment was 1,000 times more complicated and intense than the light pollution of the evil poison. The different operational rules inside and outside interfered and collided on the surface of contact. Even though Luo Nan's mental senses were severely restricted, he was still able to sense more valuable information. So much so that he nearly believed that the command issued by Lieutenant Go Yi to prepare for impact was issued on this level. Half a second later, the violent collision corrected the direction of Luo Nan's thoughts. The Earth Layer Patroller, after having a limited deceleration, still fiercely smashed into the burning ground of the area of fire at a speed of at least 150 kilometers per hour. Arthropod number 1, which Luo Nan was on, and arthropod number 6, which was side by side, were located at the very front of the Soil Patroller's 3 sets of arthropod limbs. During the transformation and repositioning process, arthropod number 1 just so happened to be in a forward extending state. It was like the arms of a diver being extended forward. It was the first of all the modular parts of the Soil Patroller to make contact with the fiery ground. Luo Nan would never have imagined such a scene a few seconds ago. He looked at the flames pouncing on his face from outside the barrier, and the ground that looked as solid as steel. There was an instant when the speed and amplitude of his heartbeat definitely exceeded the normal range. But Luo Nan was just a hair too late. He was able to capture the highly coordinated configuration combination of the standard array, the Earth Layer Patroller, and the materials of the ground. He subconsciously said, "Oh." It was hard to tell if he was surprised, frightened, or pleasantly surprised. The violent impact reverberated back, and Luo Nan's armored figure pounced forward under the effect of inertia. He was just about to slam into the control desk when the standard array and the Earth Patroller's anti-collision program activated at the same time. Luo Nan's body seemed to have been electrified amidst the buzzing and vibrating sounds. His body felt numb from head to toe, but the impact force was enough to cause fatal damage to his internal organs when he slammed into the barrier. But it was dissolved layer by the electrified vibrations. Aside from a bit of dizziness and a bit of sweat, there were no other effects. The force that was impossible to dispel was derived from the standard array through the highly efficient impact conduction system. It extended into the mechanical structure of the Earth Patroller, and then it was derived from the outer armor. It formed a powerful howling whirlwind amidst the flames and the collapsed building materials behind the ship, which was still rapidly sliding and tearing the ground apart. It was an astonishing power. From Luo Nan's perspective, this set of hardcore standard array application technique of exerting force and dispelling force was truly astonishing. "Oh, not bad. Your legs aren't weak. You can stand firm." Just this alone will make the vast majority of people eat dust behind your heels. Xianzhu still had the leisure to praise Luo Nan. It was just that his voice was a bit hoarse after speaking for a bit longer. He even coughed twice. It was clear that the impact of the hard landing just now was too much for him, who wasn't wearing armor. Luo Nan grinned. He didn't know why, but he was sweating quite a bit. Soon, a thin layer of sweat seeped through his body, and it was sucked dry by the lining of his combat uniform. He was as refreshing as ever, just a bit floaty. It couldn't be that he was so shocked that his legs went weak, right? Luo Nan was embarrassed to respond to Xianzhu's reaction. He could only shut his mouth. He wanted to turn his head to look at Xianzhu's situation. But Lieutenant Gouyi had already issued an order. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Install the docking module according to the temporary group. You have a quarter of an hour. Lieutenant Gouyi was obviously talking about Heaven Abyss time. Converted to Earth Standard Time, it was only about 8 minutes. Luo Nan had never experienced such a battle before. He was a bit stupefied for a time. He didn't know where to start. At this time, Luo Nan could see Gouyi's good intentions in having Xianzhu join their group. As a veteran maintenance officer, Xianzhu's experience in this area was explosively rich. His mouth was reckless in making comments, but there was no lack of work that needed to be done. While Lieutenant Gouyi was urging them once more, he had already refined the tasks assigned to their group a step further, and assigned them to Luo Nan and Liang Lu. Number 1 and Number 4. Just write one in front and one in the back. Don't panic. It's just digging earth and building a frame. The Earth Layer Patroller finally came to a stop after sliding for 70 to 80 meters. It had already torn a long, perfectly straight scar in the foundational material that was both metal and cement on the ground. However, its final stopping point was precisely the pre-constructed area of the blocking position, which was around 300 meters away from the front lines. It displayed the first-rate control skills of its operator. Right now, the Earth Layer Patroller was like a mole cricket half sticking out of the ground from Luo Nan's perspective. Its 6 limbs, front and back, left and right, were all plucking at the layer of earth. It endlessly expanded and flattened the foundation of the area where the ship was located. Of course, this sort of operation ultimately relied on automatic control. Luo Nan and Liang Lu were able to free up their hands after the earliest setup. They accepted Xianzhu's assignment, and continuously took out all sorts of spare parts stored within the Earth Layer Patroller, in between excavating the earth. They hoisted them to various designated areas. Luo Nan was inexplicably doing the work of excavating and hoisting, but he wasn't annoyed. This was because he was quite interested in the Earth Layer Patroller, the standard array, and the corresponding relationship between the configuration of the foundational modules used by the two. This sort of method wasn't like the space-to-point permeation technique that Liang Lu spoke of. It was more like a more pure problem of configuration. Though the Earth Layer Patroller unceremoniously cut open a portion of the surface of the tunnel area, the relationship between the two grew more and more intimate. As the blocking position was built, the two worked hard to become one. Luo Nan and the others, who were the controllers, used the standard array to play a clear role in catalysis. Because of this, the Earth Layer Patroller that plunged headfirst into the fiery zone was the same as connecting to the half-dead spacetime defense configuration nodes within the foundational modules of the foundational modules in the fire-type law environment, bringing them to life. It was also like building a high-powered jammer and signal tower. It made the surrounding area of abnormal rules become less unified and coordinated. At the very least, the stability and sustainability of the fiery zone were clearly a bit chaotic in the surrounding area where the Earth Layer Patroller sat. Although it was said to be building a blocking position, it was actually doing the preparatory work for an overall repair. The commander in the back had a very clear mind. Luo Nan had a deeper understanding of the mission objectives assigned to him by Gouyi and Xianzhu. Under the premise of this understanding, he could be considered to know the how and why of the mission objectives. Slowly, the work on Luo Nan's hand began to speed up. It started around 3 minutes later, and he no longer needed Xianzhu to break it down in detail. Luo Nan knew what he needed to do when Gouyi made the arrangements. Later on, he could even make some preparations in advance. The work on hand grew smoother and smoother. Correspondingly, the space for his thinking grew more and more ample. The space for divergence grew larger and larger. His train of thought gradually flew away. Unfortunately, Luo Nan could only let his train of thought fly for now. The outside world was a special law environment characterized by flames. Under the premise of standard operation, it was still very hard to grasp the deeper details, even with the amplification of the standard array. If this was on Earth, Luo Nan would certainly have just brushed through a wave of pure sensing. But in the current scene he needed to use a certain physical medium to accomplish this point. Luo Nan really wanted to use a syncopator to cut it. If I were you, I definitely wouldn't mess around. Xianzhu's words entered Luo Nan's ears in a timely manner. Luo Nan was a bit surprised. Xianzhu certainly couldn't see the changes in Luo Nan's expression through the metal visor. But Xianzhu still had an expression that said, "I knew you wouldn't be peaceful." Only now did Luo Nan discover that there were already a few flying ants circling around his hand. Even he himself didn't know when they were released. That big rookie over there. His brain isn't listening, but his knowledge is enough. The Hellfire Tyrant. Speaking of which, youngsters these days have been raised too well in the Jade Crystal Array. Do they have no concept of the might of the sovereign domain? No, I'm just... it really is the Hellfire Tyrant. Luo Nan wasn't the only one who quickly got on the right track. Liang Lu, who had a solid foundation in the domains of configuration and creation, had already adapted to the work on hand. He was able to divert his attention to participate in the discussion. Xianzhu grinned. He grabbed the needle-knife mechanical arm that had just left his shoulder after completing the treatment. He performed a quick disassembly before smashing it towards Luo Nan's face. If you want to die, then King Chop. I won't have to waste time collecting your corpse. You better remember the following external work. Chapter 925. Common name Hellfire Tyrant. Type: Outworld species. Danger level: Calamity. Uncontrollable restlessness. Born in an extremely harsh special spacetime environment. Once it enters the local spacetime, it will rapidly decline. It has no concept of friend or foe. It must constantly kill and seize life force rich in restless emotions in order to maintain its survival. Only after seizing enough life force and completing a temporary transformation will it stop killing and enter the nearest star to use fusion energy to leave. Output: Hellfire Gray Crystal, etc. Case study. Note: any Hellfire Tyrant that enters the local spacetime at its peak is undoubtedly at the Great Sovereign level. It possesses the most top-notch explosive lethality of its level. The auxiliary AI displayed the basic information regarding the Hellfire Tyrant in the virtual world. The last paragraph was highlighted in bold and highlighted in red as a reminder. Was this giving him, the designer of the new version of the Spacetime Fortress, some face? It was reasonable that the Spacetime Fortress was unable to withstand the most tyrannical eruption of a powerhouse whose concept was unclear for the time being. What the hell? The only thing that was clear right now was why the opponent didn't strike while the iron was hot after the world-shaking first strike, and expand the results of the battle. It wasn't that he didn't want to, it was that he couldn't. The stream of flames that remained within the fissure tunnel was most likely the embers of the Hellfire Tyrant's most powerful level of power that had appeared out of nowhere. Luo Nan grinned. The sound of the needle blade mechanical arm smashing against his visor still seemed to reverberate in his ears. Officer Xianzhu was truly angry at that moment. It was for no other reason than that Luo Nan dared to stroke the tiger's whiskers of a great sovereign-level outworld species. Luo Nan attempted to use the syncopator to touch the deeper source of power in the extremely dangerous environment of abnormal laws. If Luo Nan really did it, he wouldn't be the only one who would suffer the backlash. Everyone who had formed the standard array with him would. Then, in this game scene, Luo Nan would likely be selected as a key casualty example of the Heavenly Yuan Empire's military security training this year under the name Luo XX. His name would be widely spread throughout the entire concealed light galaxy. Luo Nan knew that he had nearly done something stupid, but it was hard for him to defend himself. He could only borrow Go Ye's orders to do external work, and leave his workstation with his tail between his legs. He buried his head in his work, no longer searching for those fantastical and wonderful thoughts. The source of the disaster. Of course, he would have to run 30 meters away to find the remnants of the Hellfire Tyrant's flames, even if he wanted to cut it once. Before that, he, who had disobeyed orders and left his post, would have been killed by the military judge. However, there was something strange. Hey, Luo Nan. Don't get distracted. Okay. Luo Nan put on his armor and left the sealed area after the external assignment was issued. He began to deal with more complicated matters, and his partner returned to the beginning. At that moment, Liang Lu was also fully clad in armor. With the augmentation of the exoskeleton armor, his figure grew to 2.4 meters tall. His visor was cold and awe-inspiring, making him look much more ferocious. However, his voice didn't change. Don't worry, I've already explained it to Sergeant Xianzhu. You are the kind of person who has sacrificed your common sense. Thank you. Sergeant Xianzhu's violent temper is famous in the logistics department. He doesn't have a family and has always stayed in the army. His temperament is a bit eccentric, and he speaks frankly, but his heart really isn't bad. Don't take it to heart. How could I? Luo Nan absolutely wouldn't blame others for his own stupidity. What was troubling him right now wasn't his relationship with Xianzhu. Instead, it was the noise. Luo Nan decided not to investigate the abnormal law environment of the fiery zone any further. He did his best not to think about it. But he didn't know why, but the gush of burning flames always hovered in his mind, faintly discernible. Plus, he would feel an inexplicable sense of dizziness whenever his gaze lingered on the fiery zone in the distance. He hated the faintly discernible noise even more. It lingered and reverberated in his ears. Could this be the backlash of the Hellfire Tyrant's control over the law? But I haven't cut it yet. Luo Nan couldn't understand. In comparison, the work at hand was far too clear and tight. According to Luo Nan's familiarity with Earth time, approximately 6 to 7 minutes had passed since Lieutenant Go Yi issued the order to construct the blocking position. The time limit of the order was about to arrive, and an extremely clear outline of the blocking position had already appeared. Just like the previous design, it was a soil patroller maintenance platform that was sitting on the beach as the cornerstone. It was highly compatible with the surrounding infrastructure modules. Like building blocks, it was a basic component that had been added. It was just that the component was a bit larger. If one were to take a picture of the fissure tunnel 6 minutes ago and the current scene, one would be able to see. The fissure had been forcefully torn open at a location 300 meters from the front of the tunnel. The lower region of the fissure had been sealed up once again. The height was approximately 20 meters, and it could already be considered a tall wall. The materials used to build the infrastructure module were the plate builder Zerg. Most of the energy reserves of the Earth Layer Patroller were poured into it, and connected to the nodes of the spacetime fortress, forming a relatively dense energy path. Only then was it finally catalyzed. Within 6 minutes, the tall and sturdy city was completed in one go. There were many functional areas within the fortress that took shape as a single entity. The defense troops that followed set up polarizing shields, close-range defense cannons, beam weapons, and so on. They transformed the fortress into a rather large blocking position. Perhaps it was more appropriate to call it a fortress. There weren't just a few maintenance soldiers in the fortress right now. During the construction process of a few minutes, 3 squads of defense troops were ordered to come over to provide support. There were also maintenance, medical, and other special troops that arrived one after another. In addition, a portion of the squads that had retreated from the intense battle at the front lines were also resting and breathing here. They were also temporarily reorganized according to the needs. All sorts of officers and soldiers were stationed here. Over 70 people had already been arranged to stay here. The highest commander of the blocking position had already been replaced by Field Officer Meng Fan, who had just retreated from the front lines. Meng Fan had injuries on his body and was currently receiving treatment, but his thoughts were clear. Though he had taken over at the last minute, he still arranged everything neatly and orderly based on the foundation established by Lieutenant Go Yi. This was especially true for the coordinated operation of the standard array. Under a relatively complex environment of rules, An outstanding commander who had experienced 100 battles could produce an enormous positive effect. There were over 70 people in the position. Admittedly, the number of people wasn't all that eye-catching when compared to the front lines of the battlefield at the front lines of the tunnel. There was no lack of elite NCOs and lieutenants among them. The dense, tight, and never-ending power structure gave people ample support. It was as if everyone's energy was inexhaustible and inexhaustible. In addition, they were successfully combined with the configuration environment of the space-time barrier. Under the coordination of the inside and the outside, some work was pushed forward smoothly. Luonan, who was carrying out external work, had the most direct feeling. Right now, Luonan was responsible for debugging the energy conversion module at the front lines of the position. According to the relevant drill manual, the dozen or so connectors of the module had to be tested uniformly. These connectors were interconnected. If a single error exceeded the standard, the entire test would have to be redone. In the past, this sort of work was handed over to the experienced and steady old maintenance personnel to do. Luonan didn't even have the qualifications to do this. But now, under the deployment of Lieutenant Commander Meng Fan, over half of the elite maintenance officers of their full maintenance team had been dispatched to the front lines to carry out battlefield repairs and support the tense battle situation. Most of the work on this side was left to the two rookies, Liang Lu and Luonan. Luonan had made up his mind to study and research deeply, but when he really got started, he discovered that the complex module debugging work didn't live up to its name. He didn't need to calculate and adjust these multi-headed modules at all. It was as if they had their own magnetic suction force. As long as the approximate position was correct, he just needed to place them in that direction, and they would automatically find their position. They would connect with each other precisely without any mistakes. At this stage, the docking coordination between the array and the environment configuration has already reached the point where it has its own rules. It doesn't exceed the rules. The dead and the living, the tangible and intangible, they can actually be fused to this degree. On the other hand, the Inferno Tyrant was able to forcefully tear a large hole in this highly fused and coordinated virtual fort. Just how powerful was the Inferno Tyrant when it was at its peak? TSK. How did it get to the top again? Luonan shook his head and sent the debugging results back. He received the approval of Xianzhu and Go Yi. At the same time, a new mission was sent over. Install a Frozen Life transfer and maintenance module on Weiji 06. Frozen Life? Luonan didn't understand what Frozen Life meant, so he searched for information. At this moment, Liang Lu, who was next to him, took in a breath of cold air first. The transport of the critically ill is done here? The fissure tunnel had been forcefully torn open under extremely unexpected circumstances. It was admittedly a shortcut that led directly to the interior of the relay station base, but it wasn't on the planned route. Naturally, there was a special shortcut for transporting the wounded. Well, this wasn't the first time. Meng Fan and the other frontline troops were stationed here, and more details of the situation were transmitted back. According to the current understanding of the situation, a portion of the front lines had collapsed due to the sudden appearance and attack of the Inferno Tyrant. The minions of the magnetic mica jellyfish took advantage of the situation to press forward. They took advantage of the distortion and damage of the space-time barrier to break into the core region of the front lines. Sir Shi Yuan, who was commanding the front lines, reacted quickly and decisively. He used the configuration design of the front lines and the support of the standard array to forcefully push his cultivation to the level of a senior monarch in a short amount of time. He resisted the wanton slaughter of the Inferno Tyrant and waited for the enemy's strength to decline. Of course, this had enormous repercussions. Aside from the effects Sir Shi Yuan himself had suffered, the front lines were also affected by the aftermath of the confrontation between the strong, forming a state of chaos. Anything could happen in chaos. Chapter 926. Weiji 06 was located at the edge of the original infrastructure module of the blocking position, fortress. It was a special passageway for entry and exit, similar to the role of a city gate. However, It was impossible to pass through medium and large-sized vehicles, so the transfer of the freezing device became inevitable. Under the special rules and environment, all orderly and precise work would obtain considerable bonuses. The difficulty of simply installing the module was not high, and the progress was extremely fast. Plus, there were 2 senior maintenance personnel with the most experience in the blocking position. They were remotely commanding and guiding, so Luonan and the others could calmly discuss the technology of the freezing device and the corresponding gossip. Is it a device similar to time freezing? How can it be that exaggerated? It's just an instant freezing into a state of imminent danger. Plus, it's impossible to use it without a certain foundation and prerequisites that are extremely expensive. Liang Lu's family background was decent. For him to say something like, extremely expensive, the price of the so-called prerequisites could be imagined. Luonan went, oh. He didn't care about the price and the like. He just used the transfer and maintenance module blueprints to try to deduce the appearance of the freezing device. It felt like a space-time configuration design. It was quite rare these days. Concentrate. Adjust the parameters and test it again. You need to have the right attitude when dealing with these heavily injured people. Officer Xianzhu's mouth always tasted weird. He was remotely commanding through the temporary group channel, but it was practically useless. Instead, he wasted a relatively ideal surgical window. He could only continue to be a cripple. He was vexed right now, and it seemed like he was looking for trouble. After lecturing Luonan and Liang Lu, he turned to complain to the other side. There are hundreds of transport routes, and they chose the worst one. Passing through from this side, they can't at least guarantee the consistency of the rules and environment, including the forward position. Is there any place with more chaotic rules and environment than this fissure tunnel inside and outside of the relay base? It's like a wildfire on the side of the road. How can there be an opportunity to choose calmly on the battlefield? The other person sent to supervise and control was Lieutenant Go Yi. He no longer bickered with Xianzhu in the temporary group channel. He just discussed the matter as it stood. Rescuing and transporting the heavily injured is never easy. Due to the awkward location, there is no way to pass through the chaotic battlefield and enter the shortcut. It is possible to transfer through a fissure. No matter what, this was an extremely important mission. Otherwise, Field Officer Meng Fan would not have specifically ordered Go Yi and Xianzhu to supervise the work after sending out the maintenance soldiers. At the same time, inside Weiji 06, there was a platoon of combat soldiers on standby. It was said that they were there to provide support in the event of an unexpected situation. This stance, if I didn't know better, I would have thought that it was, cough. Lieutenant Go Yi promptly interrupted Xianzhu's unspoken words and forcefully shifted the focus back to the technical aspect. The replacement transport vehicle will enter the transfer channel in 20 seconds and dock with the temporary module for debugging. From the preset data, there shouldn't be any problems. Right now, the variable is the transport vehicle that drove out from the battlefield. Oh, the person in charge of the transport is someone I know. Who is it? Lieutenant Shangmin, her? She's reliable. This was the first time Luonan saw Xianzhu express her trust in someone so resolutely and decisively. Goye's attitude was more or less the same. Lieutenant Shang's technical level is obviously trustworthy, but we need to communicate in time to determine the details of the rules and environment. Do you want to do it or do I? Xianzhu responded snappily. You guys are all lieutenants. Why should I join in the fun? Goyi laughed. If it weren't for the fact that your brain isn't working, it would be best to have you go over and coordinate. Xianzhu said resentfully. Should I go and let her step on me? It's necessary to provide support and coordinate from the front. An unfamiliar voice abruptly cut into the temporary group channel. Holy crap. Xianzhu clearly jumped in fright. Right now, the identity of the speaker naturally appeared in the channel. He was labeled Yan Xian, and his rank was that of a lieutenant. He was also the person in charge of the internal standby combat squad of Weiji 06. For a lieutenant to be in charge of a 10-man combat squad meant that he had either committed a crime, or he had a high position but a low assignment. The squad under him was a first-class elite. Yan Xian's situation belonged to the latter. Go Yi was very polite to Yan Xian. Lieutenant Yan, you mean? Yan Xian was also very straightforward. Swap vehicles. They've already begun to station in, but the battlefield transport vehicle has yet to enter the tunnel. I've already contacted Xiangmin. She admits that she's been affected by the battlefield, and that the vehicle is faulty. I suggest that our squad go forward to provide support. Lieutenant Go, you guys send a maintenance soldier to move with us. Enter the front lines of the battlefield. If necessary. Go Yi was silent for half a second before saying, okay. Luo Nan and Liang Lu, who didn't have the right to speak on the installation point, looked at each other. Luo Nan was fine, but Liang Lu's breathing was a bit rushed. The color of his emotions was probably a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Sending a maintenance soldier. From the looks of it, there was a high probability that one of the two would be chosen. And this mission was fundamentally different from any other maintenance or patrol mission from before. Only, Liang Lu's state of mind was still in a tumultuous upheaval. Xianzhu had already called out names a step ahead of the two superiors. Luonan can go. He's an installation personnel. He has a plan in mind, and he's pretty good at playing with the syncopator. Go over early to make some adjustments. This will save time. Liang Lu was stunned. He didn't even know if he was disappointed or relaxed when Go Yi approved of it. Luonan can go. It was still Xianzhu. He immediately said, Luonan can go, but he needs to swear a deadly oath first. Don't suddenly have a brain spasm and slice at the wildfire on the side of the road. Luonan could roughly understand that this was Xianzhu's type of exhortation and warning, but he didn't know how to respond for a time. As the superior, Go Yi didn't pay attention to Xianzhu's words. After a breath's worth of time passed, Go Yi suddenly spoke out of the blue. The news just came. Heiner is gone. Zoom isn't doing too well either. Xianzhu didn't say anything, but Liang Lu, who was next to Luonan, said, Petty Officer Heiner. Luonan had a bit of an impression. Heiner and Zoom were both members of the full maintenance unit. They were also veteran maintenance officers. They had been dispatched to the front lines to do wartime maintenance early on. Luonan had never met them before. It wasn't to the extent of being sad. But these two familiar yet unfamiliar names suddenly weaved together into an ominous tune. It was more realistic than any warning on the eve of a mission. Only the sound of the voice could be heard in the channel, but no one could be seen. Go Ye's tone was flat, and he brushed this off. He only said to Yan Xian, We're already on our side. Literature building. Chapter 927. From beginning to end, the two officers didn't seek Luonan's opinion. Luonan was a soldier who had to obey orders at this time. Even if he was a rookie recruit, Luonan didn't raise any opinions. He couldn't even confirm whether or not this was another mission arranged by the Inner Universe Simulator's primal chaos mechanism. Aside from Liang Lu beside him, there was no one else to send him off. In reality, Liang Lu's mood was at a low ebb right now. It was probably a psychological battle between being chosen and not chosen, between trust and danger. Luonan didn't investigate in detail. A new trial had arrived. He needed to adjust the state of his body and mind. Unfortunately, his state wasn't particularly good. You need to be cautious, and you need to be obedient. Liang Lu pulled himself together with great difficulty. He used the most precise words he could to impart his not-so-rich experience. Of course you need to be confident. The lieutenant and the sergeant both chose you. This proves that you're the most suitable. The syncopator must be used according to the drill manual. Luonan nodded silently. He flexed and extended his fingers, slowly adjusting his breathing. It was also at this stage that a message popped up in the virtual vision of his left eye. He was pulled into a group channel called Mobile Squad 9. That Lieutenant Yan Xian was also in it, and he immediately gave him instructions. In 3 seconds, we'll meet up with you at Weiji 06 launch exit number 2. From now until we depart, you have 6 seconds to adjust the group array to the standard sub-3 type. This will realize the docking of the squad. If you can't do it, speak up as soon as possible and switch people. Even for Luonan, Heaven Abyss's second unit, had to be multiplied by 5 in order to conform to his perception of time. But when he heard the restriction of 3, 6, and the like, it made him feel pressure from the bottom of his heart. Luckily, Luo Nan was at launch exit number 2 right now. He didn't care about anything else. He closed his eyes and the auxiliary AI brought up the standard sub-3 type group array that Lieutenant Yen Xian spoke of. Actually, this was a secondary variant of the standard battle array. It existed as a special tactical branch in a large-scale war. This was also the special characteristic of the Heaven Abyss Empire's military. The dynamo core was the driving force, and the overall framework of the combat force was designed. This was the foundation of all tactics and strategies. All other combat equipment existed as extensions and mounting modules of this framework. Luo Nan was already in the most universal standard array, together with a large collective of over 70 people. The formation of the blocking position and some of the nodes of the space-time barrier in the damaged GH-077 infrastructure module had achieved basic integration and interaction. It was as if rivers, sand, fish, and shrimp had converged into a large lake with a relatively complete ecology. What he needed to do now was to temporarily draw a tributary, with a clear direction in the middle of the vague, big lake, and make a detour outside. He closed his eyes and followed the description in the military drill manual. His body, spirit, chi, and the external vertical collar, dynamo core fully interacted, entering a stable and relatively lively state. The group channel of Mobile Squad 9 opened up its exclusive array interface to Luo Nan. Luo Nan imagined himself to be a lump of plasticine that was stuffed into the opening of a door lock. He combined it with the configuration design of the standard sub-3 to carry out the fine-tuning of the adaptability. A low cry rang out, accompanied by whistling air currents and Lianglu's curses. Luo Nan opened his eyes and saw a light vehicle similar to a jeep sweep past his nose. It immediately came to a stop. Aside from the driver, there were 3 other people sitting on the vehicle, 2 on the left and 1 on the right. The empty seat was clearly for him. There was another vehicle of the same type a bit further behind. There were only 3 people including the driver. There were also 3 individual heavy armors that were over 5 meters tall. The entire group of 10 was already present. Luo Nan didn't know who Lieutenant Yen Xian was. Luo Nan didn't ask. He didn't say much either. He glanced at Liang Lu once more before stepping over to sit in that seat. Everyone in the vehicle was already fully armed right now. The exoskeleton metal visor covered their line of sight and expressions. They all looked ice cold. Whether it was here or in the group channel, they didn't have any intention of communicating. This really wasn't too friendly. Luo Nan had a direct feeling of being rejected. But he was more familiar with the plane of configuration. It was like the head of a hammer smashing down the last segment the moment he stepped onto the light vehicle. There was a slight clicking sound, and the vehicle had already completed its transformation into the standard sub-3 type group formation. It connected with the few people on the vehicle and the soldiers behind them who were similarly maintaining silence. It was a seamless fit. Luo Nan didn't look at the time. In any case, he was certain that he hadn't run out of time. He just puffed out his chest and said, "Maintenance Soldier Luo Nan reporting for duty." Liang Lu clenched his fist to show his appreciation from below the vehicle. The person sitting across from Luo Nan finally spoke with a droning voice. "That's enough. Let's go." Clearly, he was Yen Xian, the commander of Luo Nan's current platoon. The vehicle and the heavy armor started up once more according to the order. They ascended to exit number 2 in succession, and were launched out through a special opening and closing passageway. Luo Nan didn't have the time to buffer himself before he arrived in the true outside. He was driving through a long and narrow tunnel that was like a valley. The frontline battlefield was 300 meters away. Luo Nan didn't know whether or not he should be nervous right now. Lieutenant Yen Xian across from him spoke to him through the group channel without the slightest concealment. "You're a temporary member. We don't have any hopes, nor do we have the extravagant hope of having any tacit understanding. It's fine as long as we ensure that our respective missions are completed. What you need to do is to allow the transport vehicle to maintain the foundation of power to reach the blocking position. You also need to ensure that no accidents occur with the equipment during the entire transfer of the freezing device. As for your safety, we are responsible for it. You are ranked third behind the freezing target and Lieutenant Xiang Min, who is responsible for maintaining the freezing device. You can maintain contact through the group channel and receive technical guidance from Lieutenant Go Yi and the others. However, you must unconditionally obey the command sequence and arrangements of this platoon when it comes to the specific execution of tactics. Luonan didn't have much to say. He just nodded in agreement. Truthfully speaking, it didn't matter who it was ever since he entered the game setting. Whenever someone spoke to him for the first time, they would always talk about his identity as a recruit, even if they didn't have any evil intentions. Yan Xian's style of discussing matters as they were and doing things according to the official procedures really did give him a good impression. He swept his eyes over the group channel and saw the clear indication of the command sequence number. The general meaning of this was Yan Xian had an assistant when he died. If the assistant died, there would be a third, fourth, fifth, and so on. Of course, there was an even stricter long-range command system above this. The current superior commander of this platoon was Lieutenant Colonel Meng Fan of the blocking position. But there would likely be new changes once they entered the frontline battlefield. Luonan's thoughts spun as the transport vehicle had already charged nearly 100 meters forward. Its speed was far too fast, so much so that the warning sound was a notch behind. Entering the abnormal rule area, Luonan discovered that the light that entered his eyes became exceptionally dazzling even through the metal visor. The light flickered indefinitely, causing him to feel a bit impatient. The Literature Building. Chapter 928. The Remnants of the Domain Laws of the Hellfire Tyrant. Luonan was not shocked. Instead, he was happy. Luonan wasn't particularly familiar with things like rules and domains, but he wasn't unfamiliar with them either. He was at the level of I know, I've experienced it, I have a general understanding of it. But I'm unable to give a lecture. If fighting with extraordinaries and wandering through the misty labyrinth could be considered as experiences on Earth. Regardless, Luonan was very interested in these things. He knew that grasping the domain laws and skillfully using them was the threshold he needed to cross in order to raise the level of his configuration ability to the next level. What's more, the stimulation these things gave him was so obvious in the game scene. Moreover, it wasn't just stimulation for Luonan himself. When Luonan and the members of Mobile Squad 9 quickly passed through this fiery zone, the flow of energy within the unified configuration frame formed by the labyrinth division formation was clearly affected by the dazzling light and the corresponding high temperature. Under the automatic adjustment of the dynamo core unit, the squad members, the equipped exoskeletons, the vehicles, and the heavy assault armor all made corresponding micro-adjustments. The machinery bore more pressure, consumed more energy, and weakened the powerful heat radiation of the outside world. At the same time, the relevant personnel needed to ensure the work efficiency of the internalized or mounted dynamo core. They had to cooperate in the frame state of their body and soul. This was only on the material plane. What Luonan saw on the configuration plane was much more complicated, but it was also much more straightforward. Luonan suppressed the urge to chop it. He used a method that was not out of line to observe seriously. But the problem was that the order was just that. On the level of details, no matter how seriously he looked or how much effort he put in, he could not see it particularly clearly. Luonan had guessed that it might be due to the limitations of his mental sensing mode when he was far away. But right now he was riding a light vehicle that simply ran over the fiery zone. The standard battle formation was in direct conflict with the remnant laws of the Hellfire Tyrant. What he could see was still limited. This was by no means the interference of the dazzling light. What truly troubled him was the feeling of fuzziness after the dazzling light. It was like a mosaic patch caused by the low resolution. In short, the picture was blurred. What was going on? Was it the natural influence of the domain laws of the Hellfire Tyrant? Or was it the limitation of his observation ability? Or was it a problem with the inner universe simulator? Luonan had faintly captured a link that he had overlooked before, but he didn't have the time to do further analysis before the 300-meter canyon formed on the Jich 077 infrastructure module flashed past. Just when Luo Nan believed that his squad would directly charge out of the fissure tunnel, the light vehicle suddenly came to a stop. At the same time, Lieutenant Yen Xian issued a tactical order in the squad channel. All the personnel on the light vehicle got off the vehicle. They surrounded the two heavy assault armors and carried out a new deployment. At this moment, the information in the group channel increased rapidly, but it was not chaotic. Luo Nan was currently the highest level of protected personnel. He didn't have any additional missions. The others all received specific instructions in the group channel and dispersed to carry them out one after another. Luo Nan. Luo Nan. Luo. Luo Nan looked around and looked. Nan's Luo. Luo Nan was free for a time. He turned his head to look in all directions, sizing up the surrounding environment. He was a bit surprised. This was because the scene didn't suddenly become clear and bright after he arrived at the end of the fissure tunnel. Instead, the interior of the tunnel maintained a certain continuity. The end of the flaming canyon could not be seen in front of him. However, the material was no longer the special material piled up from the corpses of the plate-building insect. Instead, it was the natural rock stratum of Vanguard Planet No. 4. Right now, the ground Luo Nan was standing on was still part of the Bio 077 infrastructure module. The temperature was quite high, but it was still within a controllable range. However, the influence of the defense configuration of the base's space-time barrier began to weaken by a large margin. The dazzling flames of the Hellfire Tyrant wreaked more and more havoc. Not only was his line of sight severely obstructed, the ground and the rock stratum on both sides seemed to be warping and melting under the high temperature. There were even some magma-like viscous streams of fire flowing through the cracks in the precipitous walls. At first glance, it looked a bit like the Blood Soul Temple. Correspondingly, explosions, blasts, air waves, fragments, and other battlefield elements had already begun to reveal a greater sense of existence. From time to time, there would be flying devices and flying alien life forms sweeping across the sky above the canyon. Of course, there were large amounts of burning earth and rock that continued to collapse from the flaming canyon. It made one suspect that if they continued forward, they would be buried alive without the need for the enemy to make a move. However, Luo Nan was still able to see the soldiers of Mobile Squad 9 advance into the endlessly collapsing depths of the flaming canyon without the slightest hesitation after receiving orders, even though they were only in exoskeleton light armor. They carried out tactical vigilance and exploration. The soldiers who charged forward did indeed have the support of the standard array. A thin layer of light film appeared on their bodies under the roasting of the dazzling flames, giving them protection. But soon, the figures of these people were engulfed by the flames. Even though the various data representing their states were still normal in the group channel, the visual effect was enough to make one tremble with fear. According to Luo Nan's rough judgment, the lethality of these dazzling flames was roughly equivalent to that of the mushed-mouth ape. Their forms were quite similar as well. They attacked the material and mental planes at the same time. Their current explosiveness was a bit lacking, but they far surpassed in terms of endurance and penetrative nature. In other words, these were all B+ rank lethality by Earth standards. But the soldiers who charged forward, all the members of Mobile Squad 9, were at the sergeant rank. They went in when they said they would, without the slightest hesitation. Most importantly, they had indeed realized the ability to survive and maneuver in this extremely vile environment. As for their cultivations, it was really hard to estimate using Earth standards. According to Luo Nan's estimations, the individual combat strength of the relay station's officers and soldiers was compared to Earth's. Ignoring the special circumstances of the mental side and the special characteristics of some soldier types, the sergeant rank was already in between the awakened and the architect rank. In other words, it was on the level between C and B rank. If one were to include the bonus equipment, then they would probably have a B rank fleshly body. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to compare them to the upgraded versions of the Deep Blue Walkers of Quantum Corporation and the Apocalypse Laboratory. Their individual combat strength was already at the level of the architect rank. It was just the difference between B and B+. There were also a few examples. For example, Lu Andy, who was a veteran of 100 battles. Luo Nan found it hard to estimate what kind of combat strength he could display after being equipped with equipment. As for the illustrious nobles, it was said that there would be a bit of a difference in rank and strength, but it wasn't too much of a problem to view them as extraordinary. In this way, there were over 10,000 people in the relay station's defense force. 1 out of 10 sergeants, 1 out of 100 lieutenants, and 12 illustrious nobles. Aside from the fact that the number of extraordinaries was a bit lacking, this single unit was enough to completely crush Earth's side in other aspects. But Luo Nan still had to say that this wasn't the way to look at strength. Purely comparing individual combat strength was completely meaningless. What about weapons and equipment that were countless generations apart? What about the systematization of cultivation? What about the most direct, standard arrays that could be formed by 2 people, 3 to 5 people, 10 to 100 people, and even 1,000 to 10,000 people? Luo Nan had crossed paths with Deep Blue Walkers many times on the plane of reality. He had always been researching burners, the archetype format, the Deep Blue platform, the Apocalypse laboratory, and other targets. He was fully aware that a single Deep Blue Walker wasn't scary, but a group of 8 or 10 Deep Blue Walkers working together to open up a formatted space absolutely couldn't be underestimated. But compared to the Heavenly Yuan Empire's standard array, the coordinated attack system was much more powerful than the Heavenly Yuan Empire's standard array. Apart from the fact that it was much more powerful on the mental level, there were also differences in every aspect and every detail. The most important point was that even though the number of burners on Earth had rapidly expanded during this period of time, there were at most 1 or 2,000 of them. There were even fewer who could reach the evaluation of B rank. But there were practically no exceptions among the thousands of sergeants at the relay station, at least in the battle order. Their combat strength was indeed powerful to the point of inconceivably powerful. But on this basis, what level was the combat strength of the great sovereign-level fantasy breed, and his servant army that formed an all-out siege against the relay station? Needless to say, on an even broader plane, in the endless era of movement that spanned hundreds and thousands of years, super-powerful beings like Lord Zhanghe, Great Sovereign Chang Yishuan, and the gods of the heavens simply exceeded the scope of his rational imagination and construction. Luo Nan stood at the edge of the fissure tunnel at this moment. He faced the dazzling light and raging flames that assaulted his face. The standards of extraordinary power that he had gradually established on Earth began to melt and collapse. At the same time, a tender sprout of curiosity and thirst for knowledge was frantically absorbing nutrients within the shattered ruins. It grew rapidly, so much so that some of his thoughts, which had gradually subdued in the collective environment of strict military rules, began to stir once more. They popped. And it was at this time that Lieutenant Yan Xian suddenly called out to him. "Luo Nan." "Yes, Lieutenant." Luo Nan thought that the operation was about to begin, but he didn't know that he had pulled Yan Xian into an impromptu chat group. Go Yi and Xianzhu, who acted as technical instructors, were already here. There were also 2 other people. One was Lieutenant Shang Min, whom Luo Nan had just heard of, and the other was called Damo Luan. He was also a lieutenant. Luo Nan was the smallest of them all. But no one paid attention to these details right now. The chat group interface was spread out with a simple diagram of the current situation on the battlefield outside. It was extremely intuitive. From Luo Nan's point of view, it was like he was facing a chessboard. His perspective cut in from the parallel direction of the Chu River Han boundary. The 2 flanks were the battlefield of intense strangulation. The green dot of light that marked the transport vehicle could barely be considered to be the left edge of the Chu River Han boundary. It roughly crossed the position of the Zhu-Lin boundary, and advanced with difficulty. There were still at least 2 squares of distance before Luo Nan, and the others could successfully jump out of the chessboard. Chapter 929. Luo Nan saw the map of the battlefield situation, but this didn't mean that he had to, or that he had the qualifications to think about this. The officers who had entered the conversation group long before him had more or less analyzed the situation. What Luo Nan needed to do next was just carry out the orders. Due to the special nature of technical work, he needed to do some homework in advance. He needed to make some basic judgments. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't even have the chance to enter the conversation group. The Heavenly Yuan Empire was known as an empire. Under most circumstances, the hierarchy was very strict. Luckily, Go Yi, who had recommended Luo Nan to participate in this operation, took great care of him. This is the transport vehicle's structural diagram, the mounting module diagram, and the design diagram of the freezing device. Both the configuration and the machinery are present. Also, this is the current real-time self-inspection status of the transport vehicle. There is also the list of spare parts and maintenance plans that Officer Xianzhu and I have determined based on the above information. A portion of this has already been carried over by Mobile Squad 9. The rest will be delivered by the Battlefield Supply Department at a fixed point after confirmation. Luo Nan instantly received a large amount of information. He also received Lieutenant Go Ye's complex and meticulous train of thought on this matter. He was quite embarrassed by this. Compared to a veteran maintenance soldier like Go Yi, Luo Nan's train of thought was a bit too straightforward. He had come over with his head down, completely neglecting the spare parts and maintenance plans. Even if he reached the transport vehicle, would he have to use his teeth to fix it? Xianzhu also spoke. Basically, you can follow this. But you need to pay attention to the basics. In this damned place, unforeseen events can happen in the blink of an eye. Plus, some people have chosen a tactical route. Basically, they are aiming for the unexpected. Shut your mouth. We've already delayed for a quarter of an hour. Even if we delay for 10 more seconds, the entire operation will be pointless. Lieutenant Damo, who Luo Nan had never dealt with before, sounded extremely irritable. Luo Nan was even able to hear some explosive noises from deep within. Could it be that this Mr. Lieutenant was still in the middle of battle? Luo Nan couldn't get angry at such a person. Soon, a slightly raspy female voice rang out. Damo, your opinion and attitude have already been made clear. You won't change it. Then concentrate on doing what you need to do. The flank has taken another hit. Tisich. The short words had yet to finish when the chat interface already displayed the words, Shangmin has kicked Damo out of the conversation group. This big sister lieutenant was really straightforward. Luo Nan couldn't help but think of Go Yi and Xianzhu's trust towards this female officer. They even felt fear. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, he heard the voice again. Now the inner magnetic coil on the left side of the car body is broken, and the energy storage tank is giving an alarm. What should we do? Go Yi immediately said, You only need to. I'm asking the maintenance soldier who's about to board the train. Only now did Luo Nan realize that this big sister lieutenant officer was coming straight for him. But what could he do even if he knew? He had never come into contact with transfer vehicles before, and he had only obtained the relevant blueprints and information for a few seconds. How could he come up with a plan? Speaking of which, how many days had it been since Luo Nan was asked to the point of being tongue-tied when it came to professional knowledge? It was precisely because of this experience that he was about to forget that he became more and more useless. His face flushed red and even felt a little hot. Officer Shangmin's tone was a bit cold when she asked Luo Nan a question. Perhaps those two cripples sent you because they had more thorough considerations. But I believe that before you board the bus, the most important thing you should do is... All I have to do is make up for it. Holy crap. Luo Nan immediately thought of Officer Damo's fate. How could he not know what he was facing? In this instant, he wasn't thinking about begging for mercy or a reprieve. Instead, he was thinking about something that was especially important to him. It should have existed alongside the battlefield situation diagram, but it wasn't reflected in the diagram. Luo Nan's voice moved, and something popped out in his mind. I want the real-time route of the transfer vehicle and the monitoring diagram of the surrounding spatial barrier configuration. Only the heavens knew whether or not the words he had hastily organized could be conveyed properly. In any case, Luo Nan had already been kicked out of the conversation before his voice faded away. The simplified map of the battlefield that he had seen in the dialogue earlier had also been wiped clean. Hey! Luo Nan let out a low cry, but it was useless. Officer Yan Xian turned his head at this time. The eyes beneath the metal helmet seemed to be observing him. Luonan pondered whether or not he should let this officer help pass on a message. But at this time, the Chu River Han boundary appeared in the virtual interface of Luonan's left eye in the form of a chessboard. The complex and changing graphical lines and numeric symbols appeared at the same time as well. Luonan would have been stupefied in the past, but after listening to Lieutenant Commander Sheng Zhan's lecture earlier, he already had some ability to adapt to this kind of expression. He knew that this was the real-time monitoring data of the defense state of the base's internal and external areas by Ant Kuei, the highest-level AI of the relay station. Those who knew the ropes would naturally be able to obtain the necessary information. Luonan could barely be considered as someone who knew the ropes. Aside from this, there were even more intuitive markings on the chessboard. 2 dotted lines extended out from the green dots that represented the transport vehicle. One was to advance along the edge of the Chu River Han boundary, and at the very end of the chessboard, he would enter the canyon area in the center. The other was to directly enter the canyon from where the grid was, and then go straight to the blocking position from the center. Seeing these 2 lines, Luonan immediately understood what the officers were discussing and debating about in the impromptu chat group. Of course, he also knew what the final result would be. Sure enough, the conservative route that extended along the edge of the canyon had already been erased in the time it took to breathe. All that was left was the route that forced its way through the depths of the canyon. Luonan naturally discarded the data of the useless region. He focused on observing the situation of the space-time barrier in the canyon region in front of him. The chaotic and changing graphical lines gave him a sense of intuition. The rapidly switching numbers were even more callous. Luonan wasn't sensitive enough to the latter, but he already knew that this path was absolutely not easy to walk just by looking at the former. He didn't know or care about the other dangers. What gave him the biggest headache was how to deal with the intense conflict between the space-time barrier and the laws of the Hellfire Tyrant's domain. The structural strength of the transport vehicle was a challenge. The maintenance of the transport vehicle's transportation environment was another. Luonan quickly flipped through the blueprints, doing his utmost to absorb the key points of knowledge within. His cerebral cortex faintly swelled and cracked. Right when he was racking his brains, Lieutenant Yen spoke in a deep voice. "What's your opinion?" "Me?" Luonan was startled, but he knew that he didn't have the time to hesitate. He immediately gritted his teeth and answered, "I need to do an on-the-spot survey and adapt." This definitely wasn't a good answer, but Lieutenant Yen Xian didn't have any other reaction. He just said, "Then let's go. The light vehicles in front are unable to pass. You activate the follow mode and pin down Jiegang. I'll be behind you." Jiegang was a member of Mech Class 9. Luonan was one of the pilots of the heavy assault armor. He glanced to the left, looking at the steel behemoth that was 3 times his height and 50 times his weight. Luonan had already activated the relevant interface on the Dynamo Core program. Naturally, Luonan had no reason to refuse. You don't need to think too much for now. Concentrate on studying the data. You need to display your usefulness in the transport vehicle. Lieutenant Yen Xian didn't say what would happen if Luonan didn't display his usefulness. Luonan didn't want to know. The auxiliary AI vibrated once more. It was Lieutenant Go Yi who sent more data. It was an extremely considerate solution to the problem of magnetic coils and energy storage tanks. Xianzhu's message followed closely behind. "Don't worry. There are quite a few field maintenance soldiers over there. We aren't crazy enough to let you shoulder the burden alone." Luonan's eyelids twitched. Even though Xianzhu said these things to reduce the pressure on him, Luonan acted as if he hadn't seen these words. Lieutenant Yen Xian didn't tarry any longer. After receiving the latest information from the scouting outpost, he issued an order in the squad channel. The entire squad advanced forward. A total of 11 people, including Luonan, completely submerged into the ceaselessly burning and collapsing rock canyon before them in less than half a second. Luonan left the basic construction module and stepped onto the natural rock layer of the planet. The ever-bright virtual interface on Luonan's left retina clearly dimmed by a layer. Part of it was due to the effect of the intense light, but the majority of it was due to the interference of the shattered domain laws of the Hellfire Tyrant behind the dazzling flames. This complicated and shattered law was so close to Luo Nan. If it weren't for the isolation of the exoskeleton armor and the Type S3 array, Luo Nan might have already melted inside. But even at this distance, the details of the flames were still blurred like a mosaic. How strange. Who cares? Luo Nan narrowed his eyes. He used his eyelids to isolate the piercing flames, maintaining the purity of his thoughts. At this moment, even the mysteries of the Hellfire Tyrant's domain laws had to make way for the mission he shouldered. Sergeant Jie Gang drove his heavy assault armor up ahead, directly smashing through the wall of fire and the ceaselessly falling earth and rock fragments. He forcefully opened up a path forward in the depths of the already half-collapsed canyon. At the same time, he pulled Luo Nan along, maintaining relative synchronization. Lieutenant Yen Xian was endlessly adjusting the weight of each member of the squad receiving the array's blessing. No matter how he adjusted it, Luo Nan would always be the one with the highest priority. So much so that Luo Nan's vision was completely blocked several hundred meters ahead. There were no other changes to Luo Nan's body aside from the floating dust and the elevated temperature caused by the scorching flames. Under these conditions, Luo Nan endlessly integrated the design blueprints, the transfer vehicle's real-time self-inspection results, the surrounding environment. Of course, there were also the nesting and functional relationships of the space-time barrier, the standard combat array, and other large and small configuration systems. He knew that time was of the essence. He simply gave up on the material and mechanical parts, and only focused on one. Because of this, the knowledge and information he grasped didn't have a standard to refer to. All he had was the general network of thought that was established on the foundation of configuration, as well as his mind that gradually stabilized. Suddenly, an order pierced into the group channel in Luo Nan's auxiliary AI mission system at the same time. It included the corresponding authority and signal link. And the most core sentence was, "Get in the car." Chapter 930. Did the transfer vehicle come down just like that? Just looking at the momentum of the landslide above their heads, it was as if they were all buried alive. Should he charge in under these circumstances? In the end, Luo Nan was not an elite who had experienced hundreds of battles on the battlefield. He instinctively analyzed the situation when he saw the collision of flint and stone, and the momentum of the landslide pouring down. The problem was that he was currently in the middle of the platoon. It was simply not his turn to make a judgment. He did not move. The heavy assault armor in front of him was pulling him to move. Behind him, Lieutenant Yen Xian was forcing him to move. There was no need to shout to urge him. The configuration change of the platoon array was the clearest command. Luo Nan did not resist. He made the choice that was most in line with battlefield discipline at this time. He completed a series of adjustments with the standard movements of a drill. His entire body was like an arrow shot by an incorporeal bowstring. He followed behind the heavy assault armor and charged into the flood of flames and rubble. In this moment, Luo Nan faintly found the feeling he had when he fought with Gong Qi some time ago. Especially the blazing high temperature that distorted the surrounding air, and even the form of all matter. It was extremely similar to the lava cavern that was the final battlefield back then. But the current situation was not the same as back then, when he had the Pearl of Wisdom in his hands. It was far too chaotic. The whistling flood of rubble, wrapped in raging flames, continuously battered down. It was like the continuous beating of a large drum by his side. The shockwaves stirred his internal organs, rocking them back and forth. This proved that the defensive power of the platoon battle array was still in play. The heavy assault armor that opened up the path also tore through the most destructive force of the landslide's frontal assault. This gave Luo Nan the space to adjust his strength. As for the transfer vehicle that looked as if it wanted to smash all the receiving personnel to death, its enormous body, which was like a heavy truck, clearly had a reverse brake in the middle of its descent. The damage to one side of the maglev device caused the vehicle to lose balance. The rear end smashed heavily into the rock wall of the canyon, forming an even more astonishing landslide of rubble. However, it was not enough to fall straight down and lead to a tragedy of suicide. Luo Nan did not need to be reminded to know that the time had come when the transfer vehicle did its best to adjust its position in midair. But Luonan didn't need to put much effort into it. The virtual vision of his left eye already displayed a simulated route leading to the objective of this operation. It even marked out the specific methods and nodes of exertion. All Luonan needed to do was precisely execute. Actually, even if he made a mistake in his execution, Lieutenant Yan Xian, who had been following him like a shadow, would certainly be his final insurance. Luonan was able to clearly sense that Lieutenant Yan Xian had already chased him to a distance that was within arm's reach. Luonan could exert his strength from behind at any time. Rookies really don't make people feel at ease. The corner of Luonan's mouth cracked open behind the metal visor. His state of mind became increasingly clear. He began to silently count in his mind, using the rhythm of the Earth's countdown. 2-1. Dodge. Yan Xian, who was behind Luonan, suddenly changed his orders. Luonan, who had already begun to twist his waist to exert strength, was forcefully knocked down by the steel body charging at him from behind. And the already tall and sturdy torso of the heavy assault armor in front of Luonan swelled up several times in this instant. Its two arms came together with a bang, and its mechanical modules deformed to prop up a large shield of considerable surface area. It protected Luonan, Yan Xian, and the other two squad sergeants who had alertly pounced back. Luonan plunged headfirst into the loose yet still burning layer of rubble. He couldn't see anything, but he still maintained a connection with the transfer vehicle, so he was able to clearly sense that the transfer vehicle, which had been about to finish adjusting itself, suddenly suffered an extremely powerful artillery strike from the rear. The penetrative power and explosive power of this strike were tyrannical to the extreme. Nearly a fifth of the metal outer shell, baffles, and spare parts of the rear of the transfer vehicle were blown into smithereens. At the same time, there were at least 3 human bodies, or broken limbs and fragments. The transfer vehicle lost control in an instant. The real-time information Luonan received clearly showed that the vehicle's kinetic system was in disorder. The forceful braking had reduced the momentum of the vehicle's fall, but it suddenly increased explosively. The vehicle plunged down diagonally from midair, smashing into the rock layer at the other side of the canyon. The body of the heavy truck, with the momentum of the fall, dug almost 3 meters deep into the wall, but it was also crazily straightening itself. Pushed by the uncontrollable power, it was like a blunt knife that cut an extremely deep crack in the burning wall. Then, it pushed against half of the rock stratum and moved forward with a loud bang. Its direction was still toward the blocking position, but this way, it perfectly missed Luonan and the others, who were coming over to provide support. Luonan subconsciously wanted to get up when he saw this situation, but Yan Xian, who was pressing down on his shoulder, didn't say a word. He gave Luonan a clear downward force, stopping Luonan's movements. In the next instant, Luonan saw through the monitoring equipment of the transfer vehicle that smoke rose from all over the canyon. Some abnormal colors were cast down from above. The color was a relatively dark yellowish-green ball of mucus. It caught fire the moment it came into contact with fire. Smoke rose everywhere, and it rapidly accumulated to a certain density before exploding with a rumble. The dazzling flames that were burning on the rock layer exploded into a rain of fire that filled the sky. This rain of fire would burn and corrode a hole in the blink of an eye as soon as it landed on something solid. Moreover, there was a second explosion. It was extremely sinister. Luonan's side was able to evade in time. He had the heavy assault armor blocking the outermost layer. The defensive power of the array was effectively concentrated, allowing him to avoid this disaster. It was just that the surface of the armor controlled by Jie Gang had suffered quite a bit of damage. But on the other side, the transport vehicle had already suffered heavy damage. Its defensive power was clearly lacking. After this rain of fire, it became riddled with thousands of holes. The sinister flames that had been catalyzed were impossible to extinguish as long as they burned. The flames followed along the outer armor of the vehicle body, continuing to spread and permeate. In the short span of a breath, the transport vehicle had truly become a train. It was like a raging burning ball of fire. It launched a desperate charge toward the fissure tunnel several hundred meters away. "Let's go." This time, Yan Xian forcefully pulled Luonan up. Then he exploded into action, reversing his direction. He charged like a hurricane on this side of the canyon in an attempt to catch up to the transport vehicle, which was wrapped in flames. Luo Nen used his own perspective to quickly survey the surroundings. He saw a series of muffled collisions. It was similar to the cannon fire that had fiercely struck the transport vehicle before. The collisions smashed into the two sides of the rock walls. Every collision caused smoke and dust to fill the sky. Shock waves crisscrossed back and forth, pounding people's lungs and causing their skulls to shake. Shadows streaked across the air above the canyon. There were at least a dozen or so low-flying flying vehicles, and even more pterodactyl-like vicious creatures. They whistled and pierced through the air in a form of collision. Quite a few of them turned into fireballs in the first instant. Armored soldiers jumped out of the vehicles and fell to the edge of the canyon. Some even fell to the bottom of the canyon. As for the pterodactyls, they were the main culprits that had spat out the acid bombs. They suffered quite a bit of damage right now. Fortunately, they weren't able to drop a second wave of catalyzing poison that could have taken their lives. There was also an enormous beetle that was the size of a heavy tank at the edge of the canyon. It was unknown when it had surged up, but it fell down like dumplings. Its enormous size was simply a devastating disaster for the already fragile canyon. It gave people the feeling that hundreds of thousands of square meters of earth and rock had collapsed in the blink of an eye. Luo Nen had seen the acid pterodactyls, the assault beetles, and the monsters that carried out the long-range bombardment during his offline testing. He had been in the game for a long time, and he understood that these were the servants of the magnetite mica jellyfish. They were terrifying monsters that were created under the dual effects of magnetization and stitching. There was also the Hellfire Tyrant that was still in a corner of the battlefield. It was extremely likely that this was the result of the third and most mysterious ability of the magnetite mica jellyfish, the Dimensional Gate. This was the might of a senior monarch-level magnetite mica jellyfish. He was thinking too far ahead. But these things before his eyes were undoubtedly attracted by the transport vehicle. The intensity of their battle had already exceeded the norm. Even with Luo Nan's relatively meager knowledge, he was able to determine that this represented the tyrannical senior monarch-level life form that occupied the clouds. It was currently casting its attention in this direction. There was no doubt that the base was mobilizing troops as well, but the space-time fortress was damaged, and the front lines were in a state of chaos. The response was inevitably a beat slower. Right now, the natural rock layer region of the Blazing Canyon was close to the Bio 077 module. It was on the verge of collapse. Not only were the flames of the canyon not extinguished under the surging flood of earth and rock, but they exploded once more. Though they didn't turn into a rain of fire, the impact force was still extremely tyrannical. Luo Nan, who had already turned back at high speed, felt high-temperature flames pounce on his back. His exoskeleton armor was about to melt. At this time metal clanged. The heavy assault armor that Jie Gang piloted was like a sturdy wall. It forcefully inserted itself between the gushing flames and the retreating Luo Nan and the others, isolating them from the high temperature and the shock wave. On the other side, the other heavy assault armor did the same. It protected the other light armor infantry of the squad, blocking at least a portion of the attack. In an instant. Then, this temporarily formed defensive array was wrapped up by the dazzling flames and shockwave of the explosion. It was on the verge of collapse. And after the impact of the raging flames, an even more deadly and vicious enemy was about to attack. Luo Nen couldn't pay attention to the surging heat wave behind him. He just stared fixedly at the transport vehicle in front of him that was already beyond recognition. The maintenance plan that Go Yi and Xianzhu had prepared in advance had long since become a pile of meaningless symbols under these circumstances. Most of the information that Luo Nan had forcefully stuffed into his brain was about to be turned to ash along with the flames wrapping around the vehicle. Yan Xian was still leading Luo Nan in pursuit, but he didn't have any effective orders. It was easy to imagine that the impromptu conversation group he was in certainly didn't have any clear plans. In fact, under these circumstances, it was unknown whether or not the freezing device, which had harsh requirements for maintaining the environment, would still be working normally. No, it was still working. Luo Nan's breathing grew more and more hurried as he madly sprinted to his limits. At this moment, his brain was constantly refreshing the real-time monitoring data of the transport vehicle. Even though it was becoming more and more incomplete, more and more blurry and chaotic. Speaking of which, this wasn't much from Luo Nan's perspective. He wasn't an expert when it came to the mechanical structure of the vehicle. His true domain of superiority lay in the level of configuration that was above the material substance. In Luo Nan's eyes, the core configuration of the current transport vehicle was extraordinarily complete. Perhaps this description needed to be extended to an even broader domain. Chapter 931. Luo Nan's consciousness grew all the more lively under this pressing situation. He tried to polish the judgment in his heart a bit more clearly to inform Yan Xian, Go Yi, and the other superiors. But before he could form words, the transfer vehicle in front of him, the transfer vehicle that Luo Nan had determined to have a complete core configuration, loudly disintegrated from the intense collision and friction that continued for several hundred meters. The transfer vehicle even formed a muffled explosion the instant it disintegrated. The bursting wave of air blew the fragmented body of the vehicle out from the rock wall it had cut into. The outer shell of the vehicle split into pieces, and the parts and fragments filled the sky. There were even human figures bursting out from within the vehicle. Luo Nan's eyelids twitched violently behind the metal visor. He also felt some fluctuations in the mind of Lieutenant Yan Xian beside him. The frequency at which Lieutenant Yan Xian's head swayed left and right clearly increased. It was clear that Lieutenant Yan Xian was intimidated by the situation before his eyes, and was somewhat distracted. Of course Luo Nan was affected as well. The situation he saw with his own eyes, and his deeper perceptual judgment formed a solid collision. But soon his brain won over his eyes. His mouth was a step ahead as he gasped for breath and hissed. There's no problem with the freezing device. Lieutenant Yan Xian tilted his head to the side. Then he gave an unexpected answer. Yes, there's no problem. Ha! Luo Nan's psychological analysis of Lieutenant Yan Xian was clearly wrong, but his most crucial judgment hit the bull's eye. After the aftermath of the explosion dissipated, the situation became increasingly clear. It was true that the transfer vehicle had exploded, but its core, the cabin that carried the freezing device, was still basically intact. At most, it was a bit blackened by the smoke and fire. Instead, it seized the opportunity to break free from the insidious flames catalyzed by the pterosaur's acid bomb. It also broke free from the negative effects of the vehicle's completely out of control. It relied on its own miniature power pump to continue advancing towards the blocking position in a maglev state. Though its speed was 2 levels slower, it was much steadier than before. As for the human figures bursting out from the explosion, they had clearly taken the initiative to break free. 7 or 8 of them were either calm or in a sorry state, but they all landed safely on the ground. They just so happened to rendezvous with Mobile Squad 9, which had been pushed over by the surging heat wave. The battle formations of both sides instantly adjusted to their positions, harmonizing as one. And then, everyone continued running with large strides. There was nothing he could do about it. Even though the previous round of destructive collapses and explosions formed surging waves of heat that began to rapidly weaken with the passage of time and distance, ominous noises continued to enter Luo Nan's ears one after another. It was a kind of screeching sound of friction. It was the omen of a tyrannical assault beetle breaking through the smoke and flames to quickly approach. At this moment, the enemy's pterosaur forces in the air began to be suppressed by the superior firepower of the base. The distant artillery also temporarily stopped firing. However, these assault beetles that had broken through the layers of defense and were pressing forward were still troublesome and powerful enemies. Luo Nan had once specially researched the information on these toys. He knew that their bodies were enormous, like light tanks. Every one of them was about the size of a heavy assault armor, and they possessed boundless strength. Their limbs were sharp, their speed was extremely fast, and their close combat might was astonishing. Perhaps its outer shell was a little weak, but once it was heavily injured, its entire body would burn on its own. Its explosive power and lethality would increase dramatically. allowing it to launch a deadly assault on its target. It could be said that once these guys got close, the members of Mobile Squad 9, who were equipped with light armor, and the escort personnel who jumped down from the transport vehicle, would at most end up exchanging a life for a life. Everyone knew how powerful these things were, so the best way to deal with them was to seize the opportunity when the enemy's air power was being suppressed at this stage. This was to create the most reasonable combat distance and tempo for long-range combat. However, a more realistic problem was quickly placed before them. In front, the frozen living cabin, which had shaken off the transport vehicle's outer shell, had already degraded its own power. Its speed had already dropped to around 50 kilometers per hour, and it was advancing less than 15 meters per second. And it was still nearly a kilometer away from the assault position. The group channel, which had been silent for a long time, finally refreshed with new orders. In this instant, the officers of Mobile Squad 9 practically flipped their bodies at the same time, forming a retreating, defending, and attacking formation. The escort personnel of the transport vehicle were just a bit late, but they also made corresponding changes. Aside from Luo Nan and Yen Xian, everyone else clearly slowed down in the span of a breath or two. As for those assault beetles, their entire bodies had already been set aflame just as they emerged from the dazzling flames. They entered a berserk state, and their speed continued to soar. The distance between the two sides had been erased by more than half with one drop, and the ones at the very back had already begun to exchange fire with the enemy. Even though Luo Nan was a rookie on the battlefield, he knew that this absolutely wasn't the best tactical choice. Casualties appeared in practically the first instant. Luo Nan could only watch helplessly as a certain code name dimmed down in the group channel. Before he could react, another code name appeared. Strictly speaking, Luo Nan didn't know the people of Mobile Squad 9. They were separated by a visor when they met. Even if Luo Nan changed places and changed attire, Luo Nan wouldn't be able to recognize him. It was just that the innate emotional mechanism of humans displayed its effect at this moment. This change was like a whip that directly lashed at the top of Luo Nan's head, causing his entire cerebral cortex to twitch. "I'll go speed up," Luo Nan blurted out. "Protection is the #1 priority." Lieutenant Yen Xian's voice was so calm that it didn't seem like a real person's. Luo Nan didn't argue with him. It was also at this moment that the plan in his mind suddenly became clear. He began to output into the temporary channel connected to Go Yi and Xianzhu. He adjusted and selected the tools and spare parts he needed. The two officers had previously designated a large portion of the items. Luo Nan didn't request for additional items. He needed to save time. There were no arguments in the channel either. The two officers, who were also the seniors of the maintenance soldiers, chose to let the frontline maintenance soldiers follow their own train of thought at this critical moment. This was also to save time. Confirm. Fire. The spare parts Luo Nan requested were fired from the location of the assault array, through guidance technology. They were thrown to the place they had to pass through in order to receive them. But what arrived first were 3 blazing flashes of light. They practically streaked across everyone's scalps. They exploded a few meters behind Luo Nan. To be more precise, they exploded in the line of fire formed by the assault personnel behind him. The assault position, fortress, was the artillery support. The number of assault beetles that were blown over was secondary. What was important was that it formed an even larger landslide. It completely blocked off the path to Flaming Canyon behind the line of fire. The offensive of the vicious assault beetles had suffered a setback. But it was only a setback. The magnetic mica jellyfish of the senior monarch level had certainly set Flaming Canyon as an extremely high priority. The servant army of the frontline battlefield poured in regardless of the cost. These stitched freaks, who had no concept of fear and death, displayed a crazy drive to blast open the defensive barrier of time and space. They used the explosions of their own kind as their main attack, and they used their sharp limbs to dig as support. In the blink of an eye and a breath of time, the collapsed canyon passage was forcefully pierced through by the swarm of assault beetles. This kind of investment seemed to be enough to carry out a few waves of assaults against the assault position ahead. In fact, the assault position had already entered a state of war. They had begun to execute the assault mission. Luonan divided a portion of his mind to pay attention to the battle situation. But his thoughts were not chaotic. Instead, his thoughts became clearer and clearer. The spare parts and toolboxes were already in place ahead. To the side, the outer cabin of the maglev propulsion frozen alive installation was already a short distance behind them. It was even easier to calculate ahead of time. He could faintly feel Lieutenant Yen Xian's gaze turn over. This was a critical juncture where he needed to make a move. If Luonan did not react in time, Yen Xian would do the same as before and make the decision for him. This time, there was really no need. Luonan exhaled and inhaled from behind his visor. He sent out a message in the group channel, "Prepare to dock." This time he did not count down. He directly exerted force after the preparatory work was completed. The exoskeleton armor that covered his entire body gave him an even greater restraint. Actually, the expansion and contraction of the muscles of his entire body formed an even more explosive force that propelled him to the side and forward. In the end, Luonan was not a true rookie recruit. Even though he had never experienced a battlefield like this, he had crossed swords with all sorts of people on Earth. This experience was enough to temper his judgment and action power at critical junctures. In this moment, the state of the outer cabin of the frozen alive installation, the state of the squad, the state of the spare parts box ahead, and his own state all appeared in his mind in a configuration mode that was detached from the substance. The configuration mode continuously refreshed and changed. Whether it was calculation, prediction, or intuition, there was nothing wrong with Luonan's ejection trajectory, and the forward path of the outer cabin of the frozen alive installation converged in an instant 20 meters ahead of him. It was at the midline of the canyon, and there was precisely the location of the spare parts box that had been launched over. Luonan took the first step and unlocked the privileges of the spare parts box through the air. He controlled this box made of special materials and placed it flat on the flame-covered ground. Luonan, who was suspended in midair, waited for a moment in this position. The belated outer cabin of the frozen alive installation passed through the top of the spare parts box and collided head-on. A muffled sound rang out as the spare parts box accurately adhered to the bottom of the outer cabin of the frozen alive installation. At the same time, a data link was realized. As for Luonan, he had already obtained the relevant privileges earlier. Right now he displayed his usefulness. The outer cabin of the frozen alive installation, which was completely in the state of a lump of iron, opened a door in front of it. Luonan shrunk his body and rolled, smashing his body inside. Luonan's ears buzzed and vibrated in this moment. Then he collided with a layer of nothingness, an air buffer membrane. He spun a dozen times in this not-so-spacious area, and the powerful momentum was digested. It was just that Luonan couldn't control his body's balance too firmly for the sake of ensuring the relative stability of his brain and lungs. The air buffer membrane disappeared, and his shoulders and hips smashed onto the floor of the carriage with a bang. Luonan didn't have any other reactions aside from gasping for breath. At most, he took the opportunity to test the state of the spare parts box through the floor. Then he propped himself up and looked out the only side window. He saw Lieutenant Yen Xian's figure shoot back at high speed from outside. Clearly, he had already returned to the front lines of battle. Luonan's gaze turned back. It was unavoidable that his gaze was attracted by the translucent, frozen alive installation at the center of the cabin. The person inside that had entered a frozen alive state seemed familiar. Whether it was the tall and astonishing torso, or the malevolent metal prosthesis that blended with flesh and blood on its cheeks, it gave off an extremely deep impression. Luonan had seen this person 2 days ago. That's right. This was one of the high-ranking officers of the relay station, the commander of the elite mobility force, Sir Shi Yuan. Hold on. If this person was here, then who was the one resisting the Hellfire Tyrant on the front lines? Chapter 932. Luonan was slightly startled. A good problem appeared before his eyes. It was worth researching, but he didn't take it a step further. His energy really didn't allow him to. Instead of thinking about these things, he might as well take the opportunity to catch a few breaths and slow down his sluggish and weak state. Phew. What a freak. Luonan did his best to calm his breathing. He felt the repeated process of sweat overflowing his skin and being sucked dry by the combat uniform. His mouth mumbled some meaningless words. His state hadn't been good since he arrived at the battlefield today. He was tired, dizzy, irritated. His physical strength consumption had increased quite a bit compared to normal. Luonan guessed that it was either because he didn't have the experience of long-term service in the medium to large standard arrays, or because he didn't have enough skills in carrying heavy loads. Or maybe the chaotic rules and environment outside gave him, a sensitive outsider, too much interference. But in any case, physical strength was absolutely not an excuse for not doing a good job. He exerted himself to gasp for a few breaths. He half knelt on the cabin board and used the preset control panel to remotely control the spare parts container that was only separated by a board. He inspected the modules and spare parts inside and made a preliminary classification in his mind. In a certain sense, the spare parts container was equivalent to a miniature munitions factory for a qualified maintenance soldier. Luonan, who had just started his career as a maintenance soldier, could still be considered a qualified maintenance soldier. There was still room for discussion. But his mind really did store a sizable design blueprint and a configuration framework with even more guiding significance. After a few hurried breaths, the inspection was completed and his train of thought became clear once more. Luonan began to knock on the cabin board. He had seen the structural diagram of the transport vehicle before. He knew that this cabin was originally in the middle of the vehicle. There was room for protection and buffer space in all four directions. Of course, there were also corresponding entrances and exits. He had to bring his tools up. Move forward another half an arm. You have 0.4 seconds. A hoarse female voice came from the shadowy area formed on the other side of the freeze-alive device without warning. Luonan didn't find it strange at all. No matter how the vehicle disintegrated or how many guards jumped or were injured, Lieutenant Xiangmin, the only member of the medical sequence, would certainly be on the side of the freeze-alive device. Lieutenant Xiangmin was the one who unloaded Luonan's momentum when he crashed inside. It was just that Luonan and Xiangmin didn't have the leisure to do so. They didn't have the time to greet or chat. But now, when it came to maintaining the state of the freezing device, they had to communicate. Luonan also felt the need to explain a bit. I need 1 second. I need to take out the parts and complete the necessary assembly in the spare parts box. Then we need to fix and maintain the frozen alive device state and adjust the adaptability with the adapter port. Also, I need to take care of your injuries. Cough, cough, cough. Luonan spoke too fast, and he had to switch time units in the middle. His breathing was uneven, so he couldn't help but cough in the end. My injuries? In the shadows, Lieutenant Xiangmin seemed to sneer, but still agreed. 1 second, get ready. Luonan didn't speak anymore. He calmed his breathing and shifted a short distance forward. His hand had just extended over when the two sides of the cabin split open, exposing the upper region of the spare parts trunk. The locking mechanism of the spare parts box opened amidst fine noises in the next instant. Luonan had a plan in mind. He scooped up the required modules and components and tossed them into the cabin. At the same time, dozens of flying ants beside him took off with a buzz. They marked out auxiliary lines in the air that only Luonan could understand, describing the configuration framework. They served as a medium to transmit a portion of his soul strength over. Luonan didn't know whether or not this was crossing the line. He couldn't care too much about it. The extremely short time limit forced him to use every method possible. Only after the syncopator had begun working did he extend his hand into the spare parts trunk and join in the assembly work. Luonan's assembly speed was so fast that the external vertical collar dynamo core was unable to keep up with the tempo at certain nodes. The dynamo core was faintly heating up at the back of his neck. Oh, or maybe it was because he wasn't used to violating the rules. Close the cabin. Thanks to Lieutenant Go Ye's standardization and foresight in loading the relevant modules, Luonan didn't need to use a full second. He was even notified ahead of time, and the cabin door immediately closed. Get ready to accelerate. Luonan shouted loudly. Then he immediately lay on the floor of the cabin. He extended his arm to grab the usable tools and spare parts that he had casually tossed out. He had just completed this series of actions when the outer cabin of the freeze-to-life installation was like a sports car that had stepped on the accelerator all the way down. It shot out with a speed several times faster than before amidst the explosive rumble. It practically crossed the majority of the remaining natural rock formation canyon in an instant. It was infinitely close to the location of the Base 077 infrastructure module. At this point, its speed suddenly dropped and it returned to its original level. It even dropped a bit. But no matter what, it was getting closer and closer to the blocking position. From beginning to end, the spare parts box and more than half of the modules and accessories inside did not enter the cabin. They had already completed their mission. It was nothing more than a single-use propeller. His train of thought is so crude and straightforward that it's scary. Lieutenant Xiangmin's hoarse voice could still be considered steady, but speaking these dispensable evaluations proved that there were fluctuations in her state of mind. The instantaneous acceleration just now pushed Luo Nan directly to the rear of the cabin. He slammed into the cabin wall with banging sounds. He chuckled twice. No matter what was said, this simple single-use propeller allowed Mobile Squad 9 and the escort personnel to move the depth of the battlefield by a large margin into the Base 077 infrastructure module. They were already under the protection of the blocking position. They wouldn't need to engage in a life-and-death struggle with the assault beetles. This could pull back many people in an instant. Of course, Luo Nan also knew that the core of his mission this time was to ensure that the important person within the freeze-to-life installation was still Sir Shi Yuan. He had to transport him back to the blocking position in a stable state, and then transfer him to the interior of the base. From the looks of things, it was still relatively stable. The explosive power of the single-use propeller was still within the range that the outer cabin of the freeze-to-life installation could bear. Though Luo Nan's plan was crude and straightforward, it had a relatively reliable basis. Luo Nan was not prepared to explain in detail to Lieutenant Xiangmin. After all, the vanguard of the assault beetles was still 100 meters away. The enemy's aerial and long-range attacks could regroup at any time. Now was far from the time to chat. After laughing twice, Luo Nan struggled to get up. He organized the tools and spare parts he had just protected, and began to reassemble. Luo Nan's position at the rear of the cabin was getting closer and closer to Lieutenant Xiangmin. Without the obstruction of the freeze-to-life installation, they could look each other in the eye when they raised their heads. Of course, they could only see each other's exoskeleton armors. Lieutenant Xiangmin sat in a semi-concave corner at the edge of the cabin wall. She bent one leg and extended the other. Her posture looked rather lazy, but she was actually controlling the injuries on her waist and abdomen. It was a rather heavy injury. Luo Nan only shot a glance in that direction before lowering his head to do the work in his hands. He needed to check the state of the freeze-to-life installation and perform a signal link. He needed Lieutenant Xiangmin's authority, and the other side cooperated without any hindrance. Luo Nan's current work was different from his previous capricious disposable propeller project. He realized that the freeze-to-life installation was a necessary prerequisite for the docking of the interface between the freeze-to-life installation and the sniper position. Xiangmin could certainly understand what he was doing. More importantly, if the transport vehicle had come over in one piece, then this wouldn't have happened. The outer cabin of the freeze-to-life installation had traveled nearly half the distance through the crack at the front of the GHI 077. Luo Nan's adjustment work was more or less completed. Most of the most important work was already completed. Luo Nan could finally shift his attention to Lieutenant Xiangmin's side. He observed her injuries and evaluated whether or not she was competent in the transfer work that was about to be carried out soon. Xiangmin's gaze had already rested on Luo Nan's body for a long time. She spoke with a hoarse voice. Go Yi and Xianzhu didn't have much use. How did you discover my injuries? I figured it out from the configuration. Luo Nan didn't have the energy to pretend anymore. He spoke the truth. Right now, whether it was the freeze-to-life installation before his eyes, or Xiangmin who was bound to the installation, or Mobile Squad 9, Go Yi Xianzhu, and Liang Lu, who were linked to his array one after another. Of course, this included the ceaselessly approaching sniper position, the various officers and soldiers on the position. He could even extend this to the front lines of the battlefield, and even the entire relay station system structure. Everything was in the form of a configuration. It existed in his cognition, only in detail and in rough form. Luo Nan could faintly sense that the several thousand nodes on the battlefield formed a standard battle array. Even though nodes were constantly dimming and disappearing, the grand system formed from them still forcefully established a common order that belonged to the Heavenly Yuan Empire's army within the violent and chaotic battle situation at the front lines. The overall situation was like this, and the details were also like this. He was temporarily in Mobile Squad 9, and he was currently in the outer cabin of the freeze-to-life installation. Whether it was a person or an object, they were all a part of this common order. Even though the circumstances they faced were more or less different, they were able to draw support from this common order to forcefully dispel a portion of the pressure. They could erase certain chaotic variables and obtain a powerful reinforcement that far exceeded their individual strength. Correspondingly, they also had to obey the basic principles of this grand system. They had to construct a tight collective domain to form a stable battle fortress. Understanding this rule allowed one to rapidly judge and grasp many changes within the system. Of course, Luo Nan was far from being able to see through the ultimate rule. However, the real-time state of the freeze-to-life installation, the severity of Xiang Min's injuries, and the changes in the battlefield situation within a short period of time were all within the scope of his knowledge. He laughed and walked to the side of the freeze-to-life installation. He extended his hand and pressed lightly on the translucent cabin cover. He turned his head to look at Xiang Min. "Lieutenant, you're deeply bound to this installation. You're using the dynamo core to realize control, and you're drawing support from the standard array to ensure the stability of the environment. But the leeway you've given yourself is too small. Right now, you need to share some of the pressure." Chapter 933. What Luo Nan said was not a suggestion, but a solution given from the standpoint of a maintenance soldier. A considerable portion of the assembly he did before was in service of this solution. His superiors, the technical director Go Yi and Xianzhu, did not raise any objections. At the very least, they maintained their silence. However, as the only person in the medical sequence present, Lieutenant Xiang Min needed to communicate with him. "The pressure is shifting." Where is it shifting? It's mainly this part of the mechanical structure, as well as the lost functionality of the rear half of the cabin. Luo Nan extended his hand and stroked the dimly lit air as he spoke, causing a visual projection to appear. A portion of the assembled mechanical modules lit up, and then a few areas of the bulkhead lit up. The syncopator outside of Luo Nan's body did not stop. It marked out the relevant configuration sketch in the air, and there were corresponding trajectories of light to connect them. Lieutenant Xiang Min's fully covered helmet twisted slightly following Luo Nan's marking. Clearly, she was following Luo Nan's train of thought. She was seriously observing and thinking. Luo Nan did not give her too much time. His finger quickly swiveled and tapped his chest. "There's still me. I'm the regulating valve. Right now, this design can only be manually operated. Of course, all of this is just an intermediate link. In the end, all of the shifting pressure will be borne by the entire array. I will do my best to direct it towards the non-combat sequence. It would be best if it was directed towards the position to avoid affecting the assault squad behind. This requires a certain level of authority, but I believe my superiors will take care of it." Luo Nan's speed of speech was already raised to the extreme. Lieutenant Go Yi coughed in the channel belonging to the maintenance team, but Officer Xianzhu responded clearly, "The plan is feasible. I can't see the regulating valve too clearly, but as long as the front is fine, the rear half of the cabin will only be crushed by the shifting pressure even if something happens. And the maintenance soldier himself. Stuffing the fleshly body inside is the most foolish action, but the core is brilliant." Lieutenant Go Yi finally opened his mouth to evaluate. He stabbed at Luo Nan, but he was not stingy with his words of praise. After all, Luo Nan's plan was the most feasible among all the plans that could be conceived on the spot. More importantly, it required the least amount of tools and spare parts. The transport vehicle that had fallen apart was no longer capable of supporting the more complex mechanical modules. Moreover, if they had to go to the front of the blocking formation to redo it, not only would it waste time, but it would also waste a lot of lives and precious fighter aircrafts. In the end, Go Yi only added 1 point. This is a semi-open working environment, so the chances of contamination are very high. However, it meets the requirements of the Level 2 pollution response. We have to pay attention to the follow-up treatment. I think it's feasible. This kind of evaluation was obviously shared across multiple channels. The conversation group that Lieutenant Xiangmin was in must have received it, and perhaps there were even higher-level decision-makers. In short, Go Yi and Xianzhu gave Luo Nan a solid endorsement. Luo Nan's confident, unyielding, and decisive design became the most convincing element. In the end, Lieutenant Xiangmin only said, "You'd better ensure your stamina. I have 2 tubes of enhancers here." Luo Nan grinned. Of course no one could see him. I also have a tube. Enhancers were, in fact, military stimulants. In critical situations, they were used to ensure the soldiers' condition, or to forcefully prolong their lives. Luo Nan's current physical strength was indeed another variable, but this wasn't a laboratory. There were no perfect conditions to speak of. In fact, Luo Nan had already begun operating when Lieutenant Xiangmin spoke. The number of centimeters increased a bit more. They danced up and down within the sealed cabin. They were actually doing the final modifications to the design of the freezing device and the space between the 2 people. At the same time, they also became carriers. They were set up at various important nodes. Luo Nan only used the time of a single breath to complete all the preparatory work. Corresponding to this, he had modified and optimized the design many times in his brain, and in the maintenance group channel. Go Yi and Xianzhu, these 2 veteran maintenance soldiers, had done a great deal of work behind the scenes, supplementing Luo Nan's deficiencies in the mechanical structure. The embryonic form of the pressure discharge tunnel had already been constructed. Luo Nan was still following his own plan. He made detailed modifications step by step, requesting to transfer out the standard Sub-3 type array group array. Approved. The interface for the assault position maintenance group has been opened. Luo Nan sucked in a breath of cold air. It wasn't that he was startled. It was just that the instantaneous load on his body and soul was a bit excessive. He had rapidly adjusted the state of his energy, and even the details of his body and soul frame in an extremely short amount of time. In any case, he was able to smoothly complete the relevant steps. In this way, Luo Nan, the flood discharge valve, would have minimal impact on Mobile Squad 9, who were on the front lines of the assault, regardless of success or failure. Mobile Squad 9's group channel was cut off. Xianzhu's words popped up in the maintenance group channel. "Well done. Xian transferred this to you. It's really not bad to be able to reach this step." Lieutenant Xiangmin interjected. "Do you need strengthening elements?" "Not for now." Luo Nan grinned. He had yet to step into the threshold of the furnace deployment technique by the standards of the Heavenly Yuan Empire. His fleshly body cultivation wasn't worth mentioning, but his foundation was still quite solid. There was no need to talk about how he had taken the medicine to verify formatting theory in his early years. Gym Master Xiao had taught him the 9 orifices 6 roots technique. His internal organs, tendons, bones, and skin were all practiced. His 4 limbs and hundreds of bones were smooth inside and out. He was also a standard fleshly awakened. With the support of his keen perception of configuration, such adjustments were still within the scope of his abilities. He even had the spare energy to do other things. For example, when some equipment was missing, he could bestow his own exoskeleton armor with additional functions through fine adjustments to the body and soul frame. He could temporarily act as a conductor, connecting the mechanical modules and the bulkhead to form an even smoother flood discharge channel. And since Luo Nan had already linked up with the array that Go Yi and the others were in, the area of the flood discharge area had expanded to cover the entire blocking position. According to what he said to Lieutenant Xiangmin, The leeway had increased. It had truly increased. Lieutenant Xiangmin was the one who could sense the changes the most. Her half-curled body unconsciously stretched out a bit. The gentle feeling of relaxation caused her to believe that she had received a direct blessing from the jade crystal array within the base for an instant. But clearly the jade crystal array, which was still in a state of repair, didn't have the leisure to do so. Strictly speaking, the negative energy that accumulated in her body and endlessly devoured her energy and life force didn't decrease or shift. But as the leeway increased, the standard array had more room to operate with its individual blessings and enhancements. Xiangmin had already begun to try standing up. She asked in passing, "You can also import adjustments aside from flood discharge?" Luonan responded, "Array Liegi has this item." "You're stealing the work of our medical sequence." Xiangmin didn't continue on this topic. She panted slightly and relied on her own strength to slowly get up while leaning against the wall of the cabin. She staggered a step and arrived by the side of the freezing live device. She supported the translucent outer shell with her hand and confirmed the state of Sir Yuan within. The outer cabin of the freezing live device had already arrived at the middle and rear section of the fissure tunnel of GH-077. It was only 100 meters away from the blocking position, which had already become a strong city. Luonan was familiar with Earth time, so it would only take around 10 seconds for him to arrive. Just from the distance, success was already at hand. But Sir Yuan was in a frozen state. He couldn't hold on, or perhaps the device's transfer was unsuccessful. Everything in front of him was for naught. Luonan subconsciously held his breath. It was unknown how many people were the same as him at this moment. Then he heard Lieutenant Xiangmin sigh in relief with his own ears. She turned her head to look at him. Her metal visor was ice cold, but her voice was warm. "The tool is an extension of the human body. The human body is also an advanced form of the tool. Only the soul is in control." "You're quite classical." Luonan still wasn't too clear on the classical definition of the heavenly Yuan Empire. He could only laugh foolishly. Yeah, Xiangmin's gossip proved the effectiveness of Luonan's plan and execution. Perhaps the entire blocking position let out a long sigh of relief in this instant. The work entered a stable state. The vertical collar chip on the back of Luonan's neck endlessly transferred data to the blocking position's transfer and maintenance module. Lieutenant Xiangmin had something similar, but it was only limited to the freezing live device itself. It was also the core of all other designs and equipment services. Luonan didn't need to worry about it. The AI system established a real-time correspondence between these data for the executors to refer to. Luonan's authority was expanding, and he was exposed to more and more information. This included a portion of the base taking the initiative to open up to him. But at the same time, there were a few more subtle things. They gradually appeared as he operated special operations that hovered on the line of compliance and violation. The range and depth of Luonan's senses were both expanding. He still couldn't wander into the void as he pleased. But in this environment, where the dynamo core was the central axis that linked people and objects together, possessing a solid material foundation and a unique array system, his mental senses seemed to have a place of use. Especially the rapid absorption, digestion, and analysis of complex information. This was Luonan's forte as a psychic. Gradually, Luonan's consciousness began to drift. The restrictions of the special environment were a bit loose. It was as if he had pushed aside the fog of war in the front lines. He was able to observe and appreciate the formatted space, constructed by the standard battle array. No, it was the bloodshed field. The myriad of formations and evolutions. Although the vast majority of the changes followed a pattern that Luonan could understand, the bloodshed field was able to realize an even higher level of operation by relying on these basic patterns. Needless to say, even a part of it was able to ascend to a higher level in a short amount of time. It was able to contend against tyrannical existences like the infernal tyrant and the magnetic mica jellyfish. Unfortunately, he couldn't understand anything at this level. It was just a blur. Luonan's state of mind was still quite stable. There were many things he couldn't understand in this mystical game scene constructed by the simulator of the inner universe. But as long as the disparity in the flow of time existed for a long period of time, he would have a lot of time to study it. A marvelous scene suddenly appeared in the space of a thought. Luonan saw two of himself. One was sleeping in a spacious bedroom. The entire scene was frozen like an engraving. The other was standing in a narrow cabin. His movements weren't big, but every instant presented a dizzying abundance of detail. The clear directionality of the scene made Luonan quickly realize that this was him in reality and in the game. Sure enough, the flow of time on both sides was different. But then again, he could feel from the instantaneous cross-section that the difference wasn't particularly shocking. It was somewhat contrary to the conclusion deduced by logic. Or perhaps they were converging. Luonan's thoughts were a mess. The scene returned to nothingness. But he finally understood what he needed to understand. From this moment onwards, the time he spent in the game scene was clearly restricted by the true environment of Earth's space-time. He was about to reach his limit. Chapter 934. Luonan still did not understand the reason for the formation of the limits, just as he did not understand the working mechanism of the inner universe simulator. His mind was inevitably a bit chaotic. The outer cabin of the maglev vehicle had already entered the area 50 meters from the blocking position at this time. Lieutenant Shangmin began to communicate with the position, activating the connection between the freeze-alive device and the transfer module in advance to preset it. The outer region of the infrastructure module, microG06, lit up with a faint radiance. It was an arc of light caused by the transfer module's energy coming into contact with the air. The outer cabin of the freeze-alive device had already gradually reduced its maglev driving force. It echoed with the transfer module from a distance and began to enter the docking orbit. Therefore, the outer cabin's propulsion speed decreased a step further. According to Luonan's estimations, it would take at least 10 seconds to complete this part of the orbit according to Earth time standards. From this moment on, the mission entered the most critical stage. Luonan forced himself to restrain his thoughts. He didn't want to waste his brain on a situation that could no longer be reversed. He poured his energy into monitoring the state of important targets such as Lieutenant Shangmin, the frozen life device, and the transfer module installed in the microG06. It could be imagined that Luonan wasn't the only one who was focused on these targets. It wasn't just Luonan who was staring at this scene. There were even AI systems performing real-time calculations to detect the corresponding relationship between the data of both sides. Any tiny flaw would trigger an alarm. The docking process was destined to not be smooth sailing. Having lost the complete facilities of the transfer vehicle, it was impossible for Luonan's hasty emergency response to be flawless. The outer cabin of the freeze-alive device only advanced 15 meters or so on the docking orbit. Alarms and stimulating blood-colored information popped out one after another. It was not a fatal design error, but it was limited by conditions. The docking process required a large amount of automatic calculations, timing, and quantitative work. Now most of it had to be done manually. This required the support of large amounts of frequent, high-precision operations by the controller. Lieutenant Shangmin had thought of this the moment she decided to split the transport vehicle into pieces. She was mentally prepared for this long ago. She responded quite calmly, truly displaying the standard of an elite lieutenant of the medical sequence. Lieutenant Shangmin did not avoid Luonan during this time. She even intentionally showed him all the two-way communication information and operating procedures, so that he could make a timely response. Luonan was just watching for fun when it came to Lieutenant Shangmin's specialized information. His chaos translation mechanism was far from being able to accurately translate it. He could not intervene for a time. However, Luonan still gained something in the end. Luonan looked at this extremely precise special system that was built upon the foundation of space-time configuration. It went from a high degree of automation to a level of manual operation. It was true that dangers were everywhere, but it was tantamount to cutting open the black box of the system. It allowed Luonan to peek at a certain aspect of the space-time structure and its application mode on the concrete configuration. Most importantly, Lieutenant Xiangmin's personal strength was around the level of a Grade B architect. When performing such a high standard and difficult operation, she had to rely on the buff of Bloodshed Land. Luonan followed the logic of Lieutenant Xiangmin's operation and observed the process and results of her original positioning within the standard array, as well as the upgrade of her privileges. Luonan pondered over many things outside of the basic operation, and his consciousness naturally entered a deeper region. Gradually he was able to learn more. He wanted to observe Bloodshed Land from a different angle and find more things to compare it to. He wanted to use an inaccurate but vivid metaphor to describe this vast and complicated formation system that was deeply rooted in the material plane, but did not possess any material substance. Yes, right now Luonan felt that Bloodshed Land was like an enormous digestive system in a certain aspect. It was constantly resisting large amounts of external pressure, dissolving them layer by layer. At the same time, it also had to bear the burden of many chaotic elements that did not conform to the rules. It had to do its best to deal with these elements cleanly. It swallowed trash and even bombs, but it needed to go through a complicated cycle to digest it without affecting its material foundation. It even needed to convert a portion of it into effective energy to be re-exported and reutilized. This was simply an incomparably enormous negative entropy generator. In other words, its power was order. But Luonan could not say for sure whether it was order that gave it power, or whether it was itself that produced order. Luonan's understanding of Bloodshed Land grew deeper and deeper. The configuration structure, and the corresponding changes he could observe became more numerous. But no matter how ever-changing and magnificent these structures and changes were, they were all rooted in strict and solid order and rules. There were no exceptions. At least this was the case on the front lines of the battlefield that Luonan saw. Every soldier of the Heavenly Yuan Empire was a basic node of this system. They followed the basic rules of the array system. This did not mean that everyone was a marionette, but the source of the power system that they cultivated and originated from this. All of the spiritual changes were integrated into it, forming a benefit to the system itself. Of course, in order to radiate the value of this benefit, one needed to be an outstanding expert to achieve it. Luonan's thoughts gradually spread deeper and deeper, touching upon a few similar strong radiation points. Especially the one at the front lines, the one that was resisting the tyrannical external force outside of the array system. The so-called tyrannical external force was the legendary Hellfire Tyrant. The rules of the domain manifested by it were weaker by a level or two, but they were exactly the same as the remnants of the dazzling flames on this side of the canyon. They were overflowing with violent destructive power. Luonan felt a hard-to-suppress dizziness with just a slight contact. As for the person that could contend against it, a Lieutenant Lu Andi? Luonan subconsciously turned his head to look at the unconscious Sir Shi Yuan in the freezing device. The doubts that he had when he first saw this person were finally answered. What followed was another feeling of exclamation. No wonder Liang Lu respected Lu Andi so much. That war hero could actually go to this extent. But then again, wasn't this the ultimate marvel of the power of the bloodshed domain? Luonan was able to observe more information through the strong radiation point of Lu Andi. He saw that the remnants of the Hellfire Tyrant's rule domain were constantly weakening. It was no longer enough to contend against the majestic array at the front lines. However, as the number of assault beetles and other servant armies stuffed into the front lines, especially in the direction of the canyon, continued to increase, the new interference power was rapidly rising. There was no doubt that this came from the magnetite mica jellyfish. It came from an enemy whose explosive power might not be as strong, but its stability far exceeded that of a senior lord. The laws and domains of the three parties had their own strengths and weaknesses. Even the weakest hellfire on the tyrant's side. There were certain areas and times where they were strong. Even the most stable bloodshed land would have a momentary weakness. The magnetophoton mica jellyfishes were always mobilizing their power and trying to infiltrate the formation, creating one wound after another in the formation. Many blurry things could not be seen directly, but they could be roughly deduced through comparison. Then they could be verified through the various changes that currently appeared. Luo'an's direction was a point of reference. Wasn't the current blocking position the same? In terms of tactical position, this place was already more important than Luo'an's. It had become the most prominent focal point of the front lines. The freezing device was the key to everything. From Luo'an's direction to the blocking position, it just so happened to be the route where the center of gravity of the battlefield shifted. It was also the most efficient verification channel. Luo'an grasped the logic of the center of gravity shift. The originally chaotic information was self-explanatory. He could sense the waxing and waning changes in the power and state of all sides. He could turn his head and capture the minute effects brought about by the changes in the overall situation through Lieutenant Xiangmin's specific operations. His eyes could look at the overall situation, but he could also focus on the details. He could verify them back and forth. He could gain something at any time. For a time, a flash of inspiration flowed. There was no rest. His mind and spirit were all transformed. He was intoxicated. At this stage, Luo'an's mission became a trivial matter. It wasn't that he had forgotten about the other. It was that in the process of mutual verification of the overall situation and the details, his auxiliary mechanical structure was no longer difficult. At the very least, this was the case on the level of configuration design. He would immediately take over and adjust some minor problems. He absolutely wouldn't drag Lieutenant Xiangmin down. It was just that the docking orbit wasn't long, and the time was too short. As Luo'an gradually entered a wonderful state, Lieutenant Xiangmin suddenly let out a long sigh and stopped operating. The parameters of the freezing device and the transferring device were completely verified at this moment. Right now, there was only a distance of 5 meters between the outer cabin of the freezing device and the infrastructure module Microgen 06. The transferring device was already half turned on. Together with the freezing device, an invisible force field isolated from the external environment was established. A stable connection was established between the two. Luo'an sighed and let out a sigh of relief. It was also at this time that he discovered that his energy seemed to have clearly weakened. His body was drenched in sweat. Even the self-cleaning function of his combat uniform was somewhat unable to withstand it. His power, the power that belonged solely to him, was rapidly flowing away. Moreover, it was constantly accelerating. Luo'an subconsciously leaned against the wall of the cabin. He felt his body transform into a whole. A rare experience of constantly devouring energy. Lieutenant Xiangmin discovered Luo'an's abnormality. She reached out her hand to probe. From Luo'an's perception, this simple action instantly gathered the 30 or so basic configurations that the bloodshed domain had erected around him. It formed a kind of cluster-type blessing. It was extremely exquisite. Unfortunately, it was useless. Strictly speaking, Luo'an's power flowing away did not belong to this dimension. Don't worry about me. Focus. Luo'an didn't know whether or not this situation would cause confusion for Xiangmin. So he put on an appearance of awe-inspiring righteousness. But before he could finish speaking, his mind stirred and he blurted out, "Air attack. Be careful." At nearly the same time, the various channels that Luo'an was in rang densely with air attack alarms. You're tuning into the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.